The captain thought his plane was turning left. He didn't understand what his first officer was trying to tell him. After the crash of Flight 498, the airline improved training for pilots from former Soviet bloc countries. They now get 3 months of extra instruction. They also must pass an English proficiency test. Flight 587 crashed in Queens.
Look at these rudder inputs.
Investigators turn to the best clue they have, the unusual rudder movements.
11 degrees left. 11 degrees right. Could he have ripped the tail off his own plane?
Normally, pilots only move the rudder a couple of degrees in either direction to steer the plane. Investigators wonder if the extreme rudder movements on Flight 587 created the aerodynamic force needed to tear the stabilizer off.
You ready?
To find out, they create a computer simulation of an A300 and fly it the same way as First Officer Molin, moving the rudder 11 degrees back and forth 3 times.
There. That would have done it.
The discovery finally explains what happened to American Airlines Flight 587, but it doesn't explain why. It's clear the pilot should have had no trouble handling the amount of wake turbulence they experienced on takeoff, but that's not what happened on Flight 587. They don't understand why an experienced pilot would move his rudder so violently to fly out of the wake. Investigators believe the first officer was following his training when he overreacted to wake turbulence. They learned that some trainees were presented with an impossible scenario.
For this drill, there's a Boeing 747 just ahead of you. When you encounter his wake, the upset will begin.
They were told that wake turbulence would induce the sudden roll.
The wake turbulence rarely tilts you more than 10 degrees in any direction, and it's easily recoverable.
Unfortunately, the exercise was exaggerated. The airplane banked one direction a little bit and then went very strongly to 90 degrees, which is a tremendous bank in the opposite direction.
The only way to recover is with sustained rudder inputs.
Little wake turbulence, huh?
Yeah.
First Officer Molin was trained to believe that severe wake turbulence could cause a catastrophic upset.
The first officer began responding with a wheel back and forth and accompanied by rudder, a back and forth rudder.
Hang on to it. Hang on to it.
He thought it was some outside turbulence or something else that was happening, and he was making opposite controls and was fighting himself and didn't know that it was actually his inputs that were causing the problem.
The first officer's actions stressed the vertical stabilizer until it breaks under the strain. After the accident, American Airlines changes its training procedures dealing with wake turbulence.
Once it became clear that some negative training was going on, American Airlines, to their credit, revamped the program to prevent this type of activity.
The training simulator has been modified to be more realistic. Inputs have an immediate effect. Pilots are now taught not to use the rudder at high speed. A new warning light is also installed in the cockpit to help prevent pilots from deflecting the rudder too far during flight. Investigators need to understand why air traffic control in Charlotte didn't warn U.S. Air Flight 1016 about a fierce storm over the airport.
Oh, hey.
Yeah. Good to meet you.
The air traffic controllers had more information, and they could see, and they had been watching this thunderstorm for much longer than the flight crew had. So we knew very early on was going to be one of the central areas of focus to understand it.
Why did you tell the pilots the weather was good enough to land in?
the weather reports told us it was.
The controller reveals that he relied on a bulletin from the National Weather Service. It showed that conditions were well within limits for a safe landing.
I even asked a pilot who landed 4 minutes earlier how it was. US Air 983, how was the ride in your final approach?
Smooth. US Air 983.
US Air 1016, previous flight just exited
The runway? He said it was a smooth ride.
It was fine, no problems.
The weather bulletin, issued at 6:36 p.m., was indeed correct. Conditions were clear to land. But minutes later, the skies over the airport opened up and heavy rain poured down.
By the time I got to the next bulletin, it was too late.
Listen, I really appreciate your help. If I have more questions, is it all right if I call you? All right?
Sure.
Thanks.
It's now clear to investigators that weather conditions at the Charlotte airport changed very quickly. What's unclear is why the controller's weather report failed to forecast the change.
Let's see what we have here.
They studied the reports that the National Weather Service issued for Charlotte Airport that day. 6:36 p.m. Light rain showers. 6:40 p.m. Heavy rain showers. It seems the Weather Service correctly identified the change in conditions. But then, investigators make an important discovery. It took 2 minutes for the Weather Service to transmit the new information in an updated bulletin.
The problem came from the air traffic controllers not having a full body of information from the National Weather Service.
Flaps 40, please.
So they weren't providing real-time information to the flight crew.
Weather radar images soon lead to another discovery.
This is crazy. Look at that. There are 2 storm cells moving in here.
As the U.S. air pilots were trying to avoid one storm formation,
1840,
another storm cell
1842.
suddenly increased in intensity.
They were blindsided.
Here come the wipers.
The late weather report left the crew unprepared for the sudden downpour. The first step in investigating the Aeroflot Nord 821 crash is finding out if the 737 was mechanically sound when it left Moscow. In Russia, tracking down records can be complicated by bureaucratic roadblocks.
Great, we got them. Let's see what they can tell us.
Good. They go back to when the plane went into service.
A safety and certification company, Bureau Veritas, regularly inspected the Boeing 737 and kept detailed records going back years.
When this aircraft went down, the rudder system became an object of interest.
Remember the design flaw in the 737's rudder that we discovered in the 1990s? It caused multiple accidents before it was caught.
In 1994, U.S. Air Flight 427 was approaching Pittsburgh when a problem known as rudder hardover caused the aircraft to nosedive and slam into woods nearby. All 132 people on board that 737 were killed. It was not an isolated incident.
A rudder hardover was something that occurred because of a mismatch between hydraulic pressure on the rudder on the 737, which caused the rudder to move in one direction, which could not be reversed with the rudder pedals.
Boeing decided to redesign the actuator of the rudder system to prevent these rudder hardovers.
Have a look.
Did they fix this one?
But you never can be perfectly sure that the fix is in.
The team now considers whether a frozen rudder caused Flight 821 to nosedive into the ground. They hunt through the maintenance records for any mention of the rudder.
Wait, I've got a work order here. It's from 2005 for replacing the rudder PCU.
It's a match.
They took a look at the power control unit for the rudder and found that the aeroplane had the new system fitted, and then the investigation moved on from there.
The investigators learned that neither pilot had ever landed a DC-8 at Guantanamo. They wonder if the captain knew that runway 10 was a more challenging approach than runway 28. They studied the airline's procedures.
They had to watch a video. That's it.
Because of the difficulty landing at Guantanamo, military pilots require special training to land on runway 10. But the cargo airline only required its civilian pilots to watch a short video.
Exercise extreme caution when landing on runway 10.
Records show the captain and first officer had both watched the training video within the past year.
Align your base leg just to the right of the strobe beacon. This beacon identifies the U.S.-Cuban boundary beginning at the shoreline.
To avoid Cuban airspace on the left, the plane must make a tight right turn.
Where's the strobe?
Right over there.
Where?
Right over there.
Where?
The captain can't locate the strobe light that marks the Cuban border.
You know, we're not getting our airspeed back there.
The flight engineer notices that the plane is still flying more than 10 knots too slow.
Where's the strobe?
Right down there.
I still don't see it.
Instead of increasing his airspeed, the captain keeps trying to find the strobe light. Flight engineer Richmond sees the DC-8 isn't properly positioned for the landing.
Do you think you're gonna make this?
Yeah. If I can catch the strobe light.
First Officer Curran is also concerned. But Captain Shapo isn't taking the hint. The DC-8 begins its critical final turn. The team needs to know why the crew didn't abandon an approach that was clearly going wrong.
Left! Left!
The captain's constant attempt to level the plane he believed to be turning sharply left actually put the aircraft into a deadly spiraling dive to the right. But there's a troubling question. Even if the captain was confused by his instrument, why didn't the first officer notice the problem and take steps to save the plane? Investigators wonder what could have prevented First Officer Colasar from noticing his captain's mistake.
Climbing level 110, crosshair 4908.
It was the first officer's job to monitor the instruments.
APR off. It's coming.
But he had an extra challenge during Flight 498.
Turning left to Zurich East.
Crosshair 4908.
The plane's computerized navigation system was a new addition to the cockpit. Cockpit design is a complicated process. Pilots need to be able to reach everything easily, as well as monitor a vast array of instruments, including the artificial horizon located directly in front of them. Investigators wonder if an awkward cockpit design made it difficult for the first officer to see what was going on. To find out, they conduct an unusual experiment.
Okay, let's begin.
B1.
They reconstruct the flight to see exactly where the first officer was looking when things started to go wrong.
Gear up. Looking at the gear handle.
Gear is up.
APR off. Crosshair 498. Climb to flight level 110.
Climbing level 110, crosshair 4908.
Coming.
His duties kept his gaze away from the artificial horizon.
Now he's looking here. Now I can look up.
By the time the first officer could see what was happening, The plane was already in a steep right bank.
Turning
Left to Zurich East.
We should left.
Crosshair 498, confirm you are turning left.
Please, stand by. No!
The first officer's stress shows he knew there was a serious problem.
Left!
The captain thought his plane was turning left. He didn't understand what his first officer was trying to tell him.
Left!
After the crash of Flight 498, the airline improved training for pilots from former Soviet bloc countries. They now get 3 months of extra instruction. They also must pass an English proficiency test. Finally, all Swiss crews are now required to engage the autopilot immediately after takeoff, ensuring that they can pay proper attention to the progress of the flight.